Hello and welcome to the PhD Life Raft podcast. I'm Emma Brzezinski and today I am talking to the wonderful Mandy Lehto. We are talking about enoughness. So many PhD researchers struggle with feeling not enough. And Mandy opens up in this episode and explores what might be going on in those moments. And she also introduces us to Judgy Janet. So I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, Mandy.
Hi, Emma. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Oh, so am I. I love the work that you do, and I am so excited and feel very privileged because you are super busy that you are taking this time to talk to us today. So thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure.
I'm going to do as I always do and let you introduce yourself and your PhD journey, which, as you said, was a while ago now, but I think it's always the sense of looking back on that time also can bring particular perspectives and what you remember about that experience. So tell us about your journey.
I think my journey had a lot of unexpected twists and turns because I was coming as a graduate student from Canada. I moved to the UK. So I was although it was an English speaking country to another English speaking country, but there were a lot of cultural nuances. There were a lot of things that were different. So it wasn't just starting a PhD journey. It was all of how do I get a place here? How do I get a bank account? What are all the things that I need to do as a foreign student? So there were just those logistical pieces too that I didn't anticipate would take so much energy. And it was also quite exciting. There was also the upside of being in a completely new country, different people, different accent, all of that. And the journey itself was challenging. It was exciting. There were a lot of, it's a very typical kind of Disney adventure where there's high highs and low lows, and you come out the other end, and as the curtain falls, it all works out in the end. But I think there were certain things I didn't anticipate. I thought it was going to be very structured. I thought it was going to be very straightforward. It was, as I said, I'll let you guide me here, but it was how deep you want to go into this. But there were a lot of unanticipated twists and turns, and it really required an iteration of myself, a new level of being in myself that I didn't anticipate.
Yes, see, this is the thing. I always say PhD is a personal development project and you get the thesis as a bonus. And people don't expect that sense, as you so beautifully said, this kind of this iteration of yourself, the way in which you need to show up in a different way. Was there anything particularly around that you can reflect on now or remember from those changes that came about?
I think a lot of it was also learning how I work.
Yes.
I think if it's something that you've come from a very structured environment where it's like, read these chapters and answer these questions, all of a sudden you're in terra incognita where it's like, okay, just begin and come and see me in a month. So it's very challenging not to be swept up by all of the many, many shiny distractions along the way, and to actually start to create your own structure. And to identify what good looks like. So I think what ultimately I learned some of this the hard way because I flapped a lot at the beginning. But I think part of this journey is also learning how to structure your own time.
Yes.
So one of the things that I learned that was helpful was the compounding effect of boring basics. I think it's so seductive when you start a PhD program and you think, oh, this is going to be so exciting and so glamorous. And some of it is, but most of it is incredibly dull and very unstimulating, and sitting in the bowels of libraries, taking notes on books that you can literally blow the dust off of that nobody's looked at in 17 years. So I think one has really been understanding how to get yourself to do the boring basics and not to be chasing shiny things. That was one of the really, really big learnings.
Oh, yes. Yes. I remember expecting that I would be thinking big thoughts all the time, and actually just did quite a lot of photocopying in my first year.
Yeah. A second thing I noticed, I've got a couple here if they're helpful. So the second thing I noticed is coming in, there can be this real gung ho energy. Yes, I'm going to be the best and I'm going to achieve all these things. And I think a lot of big hyperachievers, overachievers tend to go on to do graduate work because actually most people would have said, okay, a master's is enough or a bachelor's is enough. So it takes I'm using air quotes here, it takes a special breed to go into doing PhD work to
Yes,
begin
yes,
with.
yes.
And I think one of the things that now, when I look back, I wish I could give this advice aside from the embrace the boring basics. The second piece of advice I would give my PhD self is, dear Mandy, please understand where good enough is good enough and save your excellence as the whipped cream that you put on very specific things, as opposed to every single thing does not necessarily require the same amount of attention to detail, because energy is a finite resource, even for, I was in my late 20s, early 30s at the time, even for a young person. So I think that would be the second thing I would say is, where is good enough, and which parts of this truly require excellence?
Oh, yes, 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 yes. And this leads us to the topic that we selected for today around enoughness. And there's enoughness, which we'll talk about in terms of feeling enoughness in yourself, but this kind of this good enoughness in the work. And absolutely, PhD researchers likely to be those A-type personalities. And what golden thoughts in terms of good enough, working with good enough so that you can maintain the energy and the momentum. The PhD is a marathon and you need to be able to work through that. So let's dive into this enoughness idea, which is something I know you work a lot with, which is why I really wanted you to come and talk to us about it. So can you explain and explicate a little bit around that enoughness?
I have a loose working definition. I've been studying this concept for 10 years. And if I think about all the different pieces that cohesively constitute enoughness, there are so many things. And I've kind of been putting those proverbial pieces on the dining room table like a puzzle and piecing them painstakingly together to start to see themes around this. And when I think about enoughness is a state. It's a state of mind where we are in a state of chronic, and I mean chronic in a good way in this case, self-acceptance, in a state of self-compassion, in a state of not taking ourselves too seriously because some things are too important to be taken too seriously. Not only just a PhD, but our existence on the planet, to hold ourselves with kindness, compassion, and levity. That is a process. And it is an awakening to the fact that we are whole. We are not our results in our PhD. We are not our occupations that we go into later. We are not our achievements. And I think academically, intellectually, we know that. But actually starting to practice living from that place on a regular basis, walking towards enoughness is really removing all of those barriers to knowing it's actually okay for me to fail. It's okay for me to not be good at something. It's okay for me not to know the answer. It's okay for me not to be so overly identified with this PhD that I become brittle and I become so scared to fail that I don't actually open throttle and experiment with things. So enoughness is really a place. It's kind of a North Star that we keep coming back to this and reminding ourselves that we can have some porousness and some pliability in the way that we're showing up to something very, very serious and potentially life-changing, which is doing a PhD, but holding that with a lightness and holding ourselves with that same lightness as we go through that process.
Oh, that is so gorgeous. So gorgeous. This sense of being able to have that acceptance and to be able to, you talked about being scared as kind of putting the brakes on and not going forward. So this sense of lightness in being able to go forward. Could you say a little bit more about that and how the kind of the opposite, not feeling enough, can sabotage?
I think there's something about really doing some inquiry. And this is parallel work in addition to the research and sitting in the bowels of the archives and the basements of the libraries and all the data collection and everything else. It's really at the beginning when I said it's really getting to know yourself and how you work. I don't just mean on your PhD. I mean how you work as a person.
Yeah.
And one thing I noticed as I started going into that deep inquiry, which by the way is ongoing, and as long as you have a heartbeat, that self-awareness journey, I realized a couple of things. I realized that I was only doing things that I was already good at. And I actually ended up pursuing a degree that I actually didn't turn out to be that interested in because that was the top grade that I had in university. And I didn't actually pursue my passion, which was something different. So I was pursuing things that I knew I would be less likely to fail at because my identity was so over-identified with Mandy is a winner. She achieves everything that she sets out to achieve. And actually, perhaps a more interesting journey would have been to allow myself to experiment with things where maybe I wasn't so good at it yet, or maybe I would have flapped a little, maybe I would have failed, maybe I would have walked boldly into uncertainty and discovered something even more exciting. So I think start to pay attention. What is your relationship like with failure? What is your relationship like with uncertainty? So there's a blogger who I follow called Sahil Bloom, and he says that fears are energy magnets. And this is such a beautiful phrase because if you start to think, where is that zone in your research that is partially, if it was like a Venn diagram, half one circle of the Venn diagram would be excitement and the other circle of the Venn diagram would be nervousness. And that overlapping bit is what I call nervous excitement. Go into the nervous excitement in your research and also in your later in your job and in your life. That's where the juice is where there's that freeze zone of, something is happening here that I don't quite know the outcome of it. That's what I would say about fear. Fears are energy magnets. Go into them.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And I think that this is so important in the PhD because, as you say, most people arrive on a PhD because they've aced it to that point and then go, oh, my goodness, now I don't know what I'm doing because research is stepping into that unknowing. And as you say, in that unknowing is all the possibilities and excitement, but also massive fear.
Yeah.
And I love this sense that fears are energy magnets and acknowledging that going there will have energy to it, but you can shift up the energy is what you're saying, isn't it? In the sense of using that energy to take you forwards.
And also in the process of using that nervous excitement energy is, I would really encourage people to distrust their own thinking.
Right.
Often when
Right.
we're in a PhD, we're extremely intelligent. There are people surrounding us who are extremely intelligent. Comparisonitis is rife. And often it's a solo sport. So there's a lot of lone wolves doing PhDs. And one of the things I would suggest is, as part of exploring how I work, not just on the PhD, but as a person, try to get out of yourself more often. Talk to people. And I'm not talking just about this as networking in the corporate sense, but explore how what are other people thinking about? Where are they struggling? So you start to see, when you have deeper conversations with other people, you start to realize, oh, it's not just me. Because we can create this whole scenario, this whole story in our heads that I'm the only one who's struggling. I'm the only one who doesn't know what I'm doing. It can be incredibly isolating. And then those fear stories, they tend to find evidence for themselves, right?
Yes.
So I think once we normalize that everybody is on a journey, everybody is winging it, nobody knows what they're doing. And that doesn't mean that they're not going to produce powerful work, but it's just we're putting one foot in front of the other and understanding, oh, if I'm being really, really hard on myself in this moment, I'm probably cannibalizing my own motivation, my own sense of self. I need to put a stop to that. And one great way to do that is to start to build a network of other like-minded people who are on the journey with you. So don't believe your own thoughts when you think, oh, I suck, I'm terrible, this is never going to happen for me. That just means your lens is focused too tightly on yourself. And I think that's where we can learn in that moment to put the lens outwards, connect with other people, do a random act of kindness, get out of yourself. That's how we recalibrate to get back on that journey, to remember that we are enough. There's nothing that you can do. Getting your PhD, a triple A star on your PhD will not make you more enough than you already are.
Oh, we need to take a moment for that. Exactly. Exactly this sense of enoughness. And I think that when I initially we made contact, it was this sense of that crippling shame that people can feel. I'm not enough. I don't belong here. And I just love this affirmation of you are enough. The PhD is not what's going to make you enough. You are enough. Is there anything else you would say around that? Because I know you work with people a lot around this issue. And and as I say, it's crippling shame for people with this not being enough.
Well, I think part of it is going back to it. I can't stress that point enough, is doubt your thinking. Whose voice is that?
Yes.
Telling you that you're not enough. Most of us actually never interrogate that voice. We just move into whatever direction it tells us, like automatons. We don't actually ever pause and say, hey, hang on a minute. Who are you? And I think that's what I mean by disbelieving our thoughts.
Yes.
And starting to have a dialogue, because we all have an inner critic. And you may as well meet your inner critic. Let's put it out on the table right away, Emma. My inner critic, I've named her. She's called Judgy Janet. And
I love that.
And Judgy Janet shows up and she has an opinion. She reminds me a lot of Joan Collins from Dynasty. Remember that show in the 1980s?
Amazing. I love that visual.
Very critical, never has a kind thing to say. Anytime I did something great, she's pointing her red lacquered fingernail at me saying, well, that didn't work. That wasn't good. So if I understand, that's what I mean about holding it lightly.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If I say, oh, Janet, it's you again, all of a sudden my relationship with the shame shifts in that moment. Because I realized that's probably some kind of programming from my childhood that I don't need to go into any sort of deep analysis of it, but I can disconnect from it. And I know that I probably need to step away, or I need to call a friend, or I need to have a cup of tea, or I need to really think, am I experiencing FOPO in this moment? I'm probably experiencing the fear of people's opinions, FOPO. And how do I get myself out of myself?
I am learning a new phrase, and which I absolutely love. Fear of people's opinions, FOPO. That's going above my computer. Yes.
Because when we behave that way, and when we listen to our judgy Janets, and when we allow ourselves to be pulled into the undertow of other people's opinions, we're not setting ourselves up to win. We can never win, because there will always be somebody smarter, cleverer, cuter, richer, more well-connected. So it's really about, if I can stay in my own lane, and if I can hold it lightly, and if I can understand that I need to connect with other people and do the best that I can. And I've been chosen for this program, so I can't be a total fakey pants fraud. I must have something going for me.
Yes.
That self-compassion piece is so incredibly important, because guarantee that your inner critic will be riding sidecar with you throughout this journey. And when I talked about those Disney-esque highs and lows, the lowest of the lows, guess who's going to be poking at you in those moments?
Yeah.
But we forget that we also have an inner champion. And our inner champion doesn't tend to be as vocal as our inner critic, but that doesn't mean that it's not there. And if we can get some kind of a stillness practice, this has been absolutely revolutionary for me. I didn't have this practice during my PhD, but subsequently, when I went through my investment banking job, which was another major steep learning curve, having done PhD in history and then
Wow.
going into investment banking. And then also starting my own business after I left the investment banking industry. One of the most revolutionary, and the paradox is that it's so painfully slow. It has revolutionized my life, but most of the time it's dull and boring, is getting a stillness practice into my life. And the reason that whether it's a form of meditation or a breathing practice, I meditate every day, sometimes more than once a day. Sometimes I miss a day. I also I don't want to try to be holier than thou about it. I mean, there is a consistency there, but it helps me to separate myself from my thoughts. And being able to have that distance of like, oh, I'm having a negative thought about myself, game changer, as opposed to getting pulled by it, getting stuck in the undertow of this again and again and again, and then recalibrating. It's exhausting always bringing yourself back up when you've compared yourself or when you've gone through a shame situation. Whereas if you have a stillness practice, you start to learn that I notice I'm having a thought that involves shame. I notice I'm having a really negative thought, like, ooh, Judge Janet's really having a field day. Ooh, that was a good one. You can separate from it and therefore eliminate how triggered you get by it. And it's a lifelong game. I'm not saying you get good at this in a year or 2 years. It's a long game, but definitely worth thinking about.
Love that. And I think the thing of having a very smart mind is it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because
Yes.
you're brilliant, but you're also brilliant at convincing yourself why you're awful. And
Yes.
you're so this sense of the stillness practice as a real gift to yourself. This is really gorgeous, and I really hope people go and explore that idea for themselves. I am aware of time, Mandy. There's so much more to say, and we'll have all your details in the show notes so people can go and find you and find out more, because you share so much wisdom on the channels. But as we finish here, I'm going to ask you, after this wide-ranging conversation, a very unfair question in terms of to share a top tip or some top tips with us. So what top tip would you like people to take away with them?
I think many high achievers need some kind of progress to feel good about themselves. This is certainly the experience that I have with myself still. And this is something that I see in a lot of the senior executives who I coach, who are in those adrenalized, fast-paced industries. So I think there's still some kind of a golden thread between the people that I spent time with in Cambridge when I was there doing my PhD, but also that I continue to work with now, is these are very, very driven, progress-oriented individuals. And I think when we're not feeling progress, maybe we've started a new chapter, we're looking in a new area, we don't feel like we're making any progress, that's when that inner critic comes back and brings friends. So I think one top tip is something I mentioned, Sahil Bloom. I love his newsletter. It's called The Curiosity Chronicle. That might be something that you look into signing up for. Yes. He has something called the 30 for 30. And what that means is if you commit to doing 30 minutes a day for 30 consecutive days, that gives you a compounded 900 minutes at the end of a day. Plus, it doesn't feel so intimidating. So when I was working on an existing chapter, I felt so intimidated to start the next chapter because it felt so much more comfortable just to keep doing and editing and moving commas, because that felt like I had achieved something.
Yes.
Whereas I wish I would have known this, because I would have spent 30 minutes while I was editing and buffing and polishing, starting to work on the next chapter, so that it feels low intimidation because it's only 30 minutes. But the compound effect of that over 30 days is then it doesn't feel so intimidating to leap. Once you've moved commas around enough in chapter 1, all of a sudden it's like, oh, hey, I have somewhere I can jump to. So that 30 for 30, and that may be completely unconnected to your PhD. Maybe you want to start exercising because you're sitting there like a lump 12 hours a day in front of your computer. Maybe it's for 30 minutes for 30 days, I'm going to have a walk and then see how much better I feel. So I think it's low intimidation and high compound effect that can really get your progress going. So that would be my tip.
Oh, brilliant. Brilliant, brilliant. Yes. And I would also find the link for the Curiosity Chronicle too, and have that in the show notes for people too. Mandy, thank you so, so much for your time, for these golden threads for us to follow through. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's such a pleasure, Emma. I hope this is useful to anyone listening.
And thank you all for listening.